In this lecture, we're going to talk about managing classroom assessments. In previous lectures, we've talked about RTI, MTSS, as well as other types of assessments that are used in the classroom. The purpose of this lecture is to help you plan for and implement all of those different assessments within your classroom. During this presentation, we'll talk about the characteristics of an effective assessment program. We'll talk about how you can prepare to give various types of assessments. We'll look at ways to present data to support decision making. And finally, we'll talk a bit about how you can use technology to support data management and storage. First, we're going to look at the effective characteristics of an assessment program. The first thing we want to think about is the efficiency. Efficiency is based on time. So how can we minimize time that is actually being spent on testing rather than actual teaching and instruction? Our next characteristic is ease. So how easy is it to give this assessment? We want to consider factors such as preparing to give the assessment, administering the assessment, scoring, and then interpreting the data so that we can make decisions based on that information. Finally, we want to talk about integration, and this is how we can embed assessment into our daily routines to support instruction rather than take away from it. So this is something that you need to think about when you're planning your instruction. How can we build assessment pieces into these routines? When you're preparing to collect progress monitoring or ongoing data on student skills, there are some steps that you can take to make this a little bit easier. First and foremost, you want to make sure that these are absolutely built into your classroom routines. They should be addressed in your lesson plans, and time should be specifically dedicated to progress monitoring. Some tips to help you make this happen is create assessment stations. So if students can do something on their own independently, you can give them a location to do that. Then you could be administering tests that might need to be done on a one-to-one basis, such as a reading record or a fluency checkout. You can also use computer stations if needed. You want to make sure that information and materials are well organized and prepared so that students can jump right into the assessments. This again supports building the routine in your assessment plan. You want to make sure that assessment files are maintained, updated, and accurate. We'll talk about how you can do that with technology later in this presentation. If you're using good old paper, you want to make sure that student information is placed in somewhere where it makes sense and it's easily accessible. Finally, if you are involving other adults or students in the data collection process, be sure that you have reviewed your expectations and guidelines with them. It's great to have support, but we want to make sure that we've established some procedures to ensure reliability when others are involved in the assessment process. When you're preparing for a formal test or a test such as the Woodcock-Johnson Key Math Assessment or any type of deep dive, individualized, standardized test, you first want to make sure that you've had some training. There are some important pieces of information that you need to know before giving that test. You want to make sure that you review the manual so that you're familiar with things like basal and ceiling items. When we talk about a basal item, that is the item that it's recommended that you start with in a formal assessment. Many times, if a full battery assessment assesses someone from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, we don't want to start a 12th grade student on a kindergarten level because that would take a whole lot of time. So we use a recommended basal level in order to make it a little bit more efficient. A ceiling item is where we stop giving a test. This varies from test to test, so you want to make sure that you are implementing the right basal and ceiling. Make sure you're aware of other procedures such as timing, scoring, um, as well as what types of prompts or supports you can give, if any. Finally, you want to make sure that you practice how you're administering this test and observe the student to make sure that they are ready and willing to take the test so that you're not providing an undue hardship giving this test, which can ultimately affect their scores. For state mandated tests, such as the PARCC assessment or the DLM, you first want to know what your role and responsibility is in this given assessment. Before, you want to make sure that the students know what's coming so that they are well prepared and are ready to take this very meaningful test. Make sure there's extra supplies on hand, extra pencils, pens, timers, whatever students need, make sure that's readily available. One of the most important factors is you want to make sure that you are providing any mandated accommodations, modifications, or alternative assessments that are listed in students' IEPs. Finally, if students are using a computer, which is becoming very common in New Jersey, you want to make sure that they are comfortable using the tools they need for the use of this test. These mandated tests are really the big game that we prepare for throughout the entire year. So it's important that students have all the skills they need in order to successfully demonstrate their knowledge. And this includes being comfortable using the computer system. When you are collecting data, often it should be displayed in graph format. This is really the best way to make data-driven decisions when we're looking at a visual of student progress. Here are some tips to ensure that your data is best presented to help you make decisions. First, a line graph is really recommended so that you can see growth over time. Be mindful of the labels for your X and Y axis. You want to make sure that probes are usually listed on the X axis, where the performance or score is listed on the y-axis. When you are changing a particular condition or implementing a new intervention, you want to indicate that on the graph. And you can see here that a vertical line is changing a particular condition. So if you began an intervention, you want to mark that so that we can see if that is leading to a positive or negative or no increase in student skills. Finally, be sure to label your data so that you know what you're looking at and that someone else can also see student growth or progress. Finally, we'll talk a bit about technology and how it can be used to support assessment plans. First, there are various systems that schools often subscribe to, such as AIMSweb or STAR Assessment, or EasyCBM is another tool that can actually collect student responses. If you're looking to make some of your own protocols for progress monitoring, you can do this through tools such as Google Forms. When students are able to answer virtually, oftentimes electronic records can be stored in a safe place. If you are creating some of your own documents, you want to make sure that you're doing that on a school district server. It's important that records, especially linked to assessment, are stored in a safe virtual space. So this is something that should be password protected and supported by a district's IT department. So don't go creating things on a personal Google account that contains any student information or assessment data. Again, technology can be an excellent tool to support assessment plans, but you want to make sure that you are honoring student privacy. Good luck on creating your assessment plan and overall assessment program in your classroom.